Good morning. Thank you very much to Susan for getting me to come up. It's always a pleasure to come up to Inverness and take part in anything relating to the Highlands. It's where I grew up. I feel a duty to do my best for the Highlands. So, the archaeology of the modern period as defined in the scarf is defined as that post-medieval period right up to the day, and it canvasses everything really from that 16th century right through to the modern day. This is, therefore, a very long period with a huge amount of change. We've already seen from previous talker Mullen about the changes in the crofting from pre-improvement to crofting. But then as you move forward, you've got industrial, you've got forestry. The landscape that we see around us today in the Highlands bears pretty well no resemblance to the landscape that we would have experienced in the 1600s. So it's a huge amount of scale, and fitting everything into all the changes and all the research that we can get out of that period is a very difficult one. I had that conversation with Simon just a moment ago. It's not easy, and because of the rapid change and single one-off events, which most of this conflict stuff is, it does leave a lasting legacy we need to really explore. So my contribution to this event really is to discuss the military archaeology, the conflict archaeology. That is the remains of military activity from whatever period right across the Highlands. The resource in the Highlands is actually huge. I put large here in my paper, but it is actually huge. It encompasses right across the whole area. Everywhere you go, you will find something, if you look hard enough, that exists from military activity. Our earliest military activity is clan battles, and right through into the Jacobean, the 45. And there are a large number of battle sites within the Highlands, as you can see from this distribution map. But even the larger battles actually leave no trace in the landscape. These events last, in some cases, a few hours, and in other cases, just a few minutes. And very little of these battles remain, even in the archaeological record. Although recent work by the Centre of Battlefield Archaeology, Tony Pollard, I don't know how it was a few years ago now, doing the metal detecting at Culloden, was able to show just how accurate the maps were that were made at that time. But it gives us a real idea of the battlefield. And within the Highlands, really, you're only looking at Culloden and Glen Shiel, the Battle of Glen Shiel, as actually having any sort of physical evidence, something tangible on the ground. The simple facts of clearing the battlefield after an event pretty well robs us archaeologists of any trace. And it's always noted that the number of mass burials associated with the battle is a very, very hard thing to find. There's only a handful in the whole of the UK. Obviously, Culloden, with its undisturbed burials, is perhaps the one that bucks that particular trend. So they bear no relationship. The battlefields that we see today bear no real relationship to the landscape in which they were fought. And one could possibly argue, because of the sheer lack of archaeology, that perhaps just a cross on a map, saying here was a battlefield, is perhaps as much attention as we need to give. First controversial statement. The tangible are what we can see and experience, and what the public, a visitor, and local communities can actually see and touch and recognise, for that matter. The massive 18th century road developments and fort buildings are something that people can really get hold of. The Wave and Caulfield roads and bridges point to a period of time of a loss of control in the Highlands by the state, and its attempt to wrestle that control back. The fort programmes culminating in the second Fort George, of course the first Fort George being in Inverness, but it starts actually with Cromwell and its citadels here in Inverness and at Inverlochy, what we now call Fort William. But we see rebuilding and re-engineering of these forts through time. The Fort Augustus there is actually two forts in Fort Augustus. One you can see a trace of in the car park behind one of the hotels. The other is down in the old former monastery site. So there is rebuilding and reactivity. And so one should not look at these military structures, even big, imposing Hanoverian forts, and say that there isn't actually a change, and we should be looking for that sort of thing. Much is made of the Jacobean history of the Highlands and what follows, but the truth is, as I think Malcolm outlined, is always much more complicated. Our research as archaeologists is to strip those myths and legends and the politics away from that period and understand the role of the military and how it works in the Highlands. I'm continuing on a sort of thread of what exists in the Highlands. So we move through, there's a nice couple of roads in the Corriark Pass, winding its way up. If anyone has walked that's a superb walk. And the Hanoverian fort doesn't get any better, really, than Fort George. But what about moving into the 19th century? It's a period of effective calm in terms of conflict archaeology within the Highlands. It's the military activity was based primarily on recruitment and training, no more so than providing men and equipment to fight almost every conflict in the British Empire. There's Highland troops absolutely everywhere. But these men had to be recruited, housed, and trained in the use of weapons and drill, horsemanship, and artillery. The social importance of the volunteer aspect of that, the territorial soldiers as we know now from that term didn't really exist until about 1908. These volunteer soldiers had to have infrastructure in which to train. And here at Helmsdale on the photograph, you can see the volunteers' battery at the bottom left for 2 guns, for 2 artillery pieces, and a volunteer rifle range. Thankfully, all the guns pointing out to sea. But also another example here at Cromarty, on the links in Cromarty. There's a flagstaff, volunteer battery, powder magazine, and the Free Church of Scotland. Yeah, that's all pretty well. But they're tangible remains, they're visible remains of the training and aspect. They're not war, they're not conflict, but they are training of that. And so we need to pay them attention. And we've got associated drill halls, and we've got loads of other things that go along with that. Another example is the militia depot in Dingwall, and what is now the council buildings. It has, I'm going to have to work this, control, isn't it? Yeah. So just in here, you've got a parade ground, militia depot, and then you've got the barracks, Cameron Barracks here in Inverness, which of course are still standing. These are massive infrastructures put in for the training of soldiers in their duty. But we'll move now into the 20th century. And the 20th century is obviously the period in which we see the most military activity in the Highlands that we can actually see and experience. We move into what is effectively industrial wars, which the entire country and every aspect of the economy is primarily faced for those conflicts. And we have creations of military landscapes and massive training areas, extensive airfields. Any one of those airfields in the Highlands is absolutely vast, up to 2,000 men in some cases. These are huge sites. You've got naval bases, anti-invasion defences, anti-aircraft defences, and then you've got supply and victual systems as well. It all begins to come into play, and how the local people interact as well. It may seem strange to many people that this is considered as archaeology. Indeed, 25 years ago, I attended a conference in York, which was the launch of the Council for British Archaeology Defence of Britain project. And that was really the start of actually trying to, of addressing this need. 24 years ago, at the start of the Highland Archaeology Week, I think it was then, I'm not sure if it was week or event, then metaphors into a week, now it's a fortnight, I'm waiting for the month, and no one would have ever even bothered mentioning the military aspect at that time. But the CBA project awakened interest. And in the mid-90s, we could draw upon veterans, people who had actually experienced, who had knowledge of what and where things were, how they functioned. 25 years later, that aspect is unfortunately leaving us. We're down to people who experienced the conflict being in their late 90s. So we're not going to have that resource for very much longer. People who can remember now of the soldiers being in their area as a child are in their 80s. So we've got a problem, and we need to address that. So we're now in the position of trying to comprehend the military landscape from what we see from our archaeological knowledge and abilities, and what official records that exist. And official records are all very well and good, but they always end up not telling you what you really wanted to know. So we're kind of at the mercy of historians. And historians are great people, don't get me wrong, I love them dearly. But they tend to pick elements of what they're interested in. History is always written by the victors, as they say. And our historians will write what interests them. But it's the mundane, the things that are hidden, that are not exciting for the historian, that actually still exist, that we can find in the landscape. These little traces of a single building, a single structure, which may play a part in a system, but are not dwelled upon by the historian. So we've got to shine light into these historical shadows that are created. It's too easy to look at pillboxes and trench systems and bits of old radar station and think that's it. That's all we're looking at, is that one site, one thing, record it, move away. Nothing of the sort. We've often failed to understand the context and the role that these structures play in a greater scheme. As I say, a pillbox or any military infrastructure cannot be looked as a singular nor an isolation, and bitter experience of my own has shown me that I can't assume that sort of thing. One must fit these sites into a regional strategic picture. Much, however, remains to be rediscovered and understood even at these known sites. A huge advantage of this study is the records in the National Archives in London and in local archives, such as the one here in Inverness. And that can assist and solve problems, but as I said earlier on, it doesn't take much for them to misdirect. And someone in an office in England had great trouble with Gaelic place names, and leads to all sorts of confusion about what site they're actually talking about. For that matter, they have problems with English names as well. There are various challenges to the research of military remains. There's been lots of research on airfields, and such as the work by Arch on Edmonton, and their recent work in collaboration with Invergordon Museum at the Invergordon Naval Base. They put flesh on the bones. They are vital, absolutely vital. But we still require more work. Some of the arguments made is that buildings, especially in airfields or military buildings, have a particular type. You can have a type 21 pillbox, you can have a type 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, such like. Different buildings and airfields have a particular type number. And people think, yeah, that's fine, it's going to be a type whatever building. And it's archaeology by numbers, if you like. But it's not the case. These buildings change and adapt. They're often altered for local environment, for the local topography. They change uses over time. And these need to be documented and looked at because they change the structure of the building. On big sites, such as the likes of Cromarty Firth and Loch Ewe, we require much more work. Only basic recording has been done at many of these sites, and more detailed study is required. The role of Inverness, for example, in the First World War, as a supply base and naval port, needs to be really looked at. The role of the US Navy and the remains of the massive mining depots here in Inverness, I'm not sure any of that survives, but until someone researches it. Who knows? But also, in particular, at Dalmore on the Cromarty Firth, they could be further explored, and there's a lot of material that could be gone out. The role of UK troops, foreign troops, Polish and Norwegian, for example, could all be looked at, documentary or actually physically. And socially as well, how these troops interacted, in particular the role of the foresters. Well, we might not think of them as military, they were actually quasi-military. Their role and how they interacted with the local population, because they were very drawn into the local community and became a great part of the community. Little survives all the camps that these people occupied. And apparently, people just don't pay those sites any attention. Archaeology and archives, I cannot get away from that. I keep on forgetting to press the slide button, by the way. And they challenge our perceptions. We must use the archives very, very carefully. But we have also a legacy of Cold War. Let's not forget the Cold War. And studies in this period require our attention too, as these sites are literally everywhere. Right across the Highland, there are a network of underground ROC, Royal Observer Corps bunkers. The Scarf paper on what they call modern does not seek to list the research that should be done. Rather, it provides a set of key headings which are full of academic language, which I tend to get lost. I tend to fall asleep. But it is difficult to read, but it is there. The information that is useful. It doesn't address the research per se into what's required in the future of study of military activity, and indeed it hardly mentions the military activity at all. But then, as we said, it's a very broad range that is covering. But it does basically have what the research should encompass and what we should be doing, and can be described as best practice. So, public interest in archaeology is massive. But in particular, I've tended to find with military history, military archaeology, indeed, it's much greater than I originally thought would happen. And every time I do a talk for Highland Archaeology Festival or a walk, wherever I go, I tend to get more people than I do for a walk on prehistory or townships. There is a great audience, and it's a more diverse audience than traditional archaeological periods. It's covered by schools. My prehistory isn't really covered by schools, but in-depth schools, both primary and secondary, now study both First World War, Second World War. Local history societies are often great at uncovering. It's something they can get hold of and get information on. And single-issue groups, in terms of military, I lose count the number of sort of specialist web groups that look at military archaeology. It's a huge resource. The military archaeology is something that the public can actually understand, as almost everyone has a connection to it. It has opened up the importance of archaeology to a very diverse, a different audience, and it's something that the local Scarf should address. Many of the broad Scarf themes can tap into public interest. The role of persons, social, community, interaction with archaeology is prominent in the framework. It also stresses the collaboration across sectors, both professional, academics, historians, and the public, be it an individual or a community body. And we're blessed in the Highlands with having a wealth of both. Upon reviewing Scarf for this paper, I'm left in no doubt that the broad-based frameworks laid out by Scarf have relevance to, and certainly good practice. But its failure to communicate clearly makes drawing conclusions somewhat difficult. But that is something, through the regional framework, we can address. So, what is our destination? How do we get there? This could be described as Allan's wish list, but we'll see how we get on. But first of all, our goal should be to increase our knowledge and understanding of military remains in the Highlands. To put in context with the rest of the UK, understanding the processes and decisions which the military used and what that means in the broad range of sites that come from these conclusions. I'm a believer in gathering information. I'm a survey archaeologist at heart. I like to go out and find things. Writing them up is a problem, but if I can go and find another site, it doesn't matter, I'll get round to it in the end. But without fundamentals of gathering the information, we can't see the whole picture. Therefore, we need to discover as many sites as we can in the Highlands. Lots of these structures are disappearing. Even the method of construction of these sites means that they just don't survive. Once they start to fall down, they'll waste away very quickly. So it's vital that we record them before they're lost. They're our foundation, they're our building blocks. And we cannot understand what remains we can see. Equally, we cannot just focus on the military remains without addressing the civilian aspects. These are interrelated. The railways in the Highlands are a vital military infrastructure, but they're also a civilian railway. The harbours, how the farming interacted, providing and called upon to provide more resource to a much larger population in the Highlands than they previously did. The billets of the soldiers within the local community could be studied. The range of hospitals and how they coped with the influx. And even right down to pubs and how they affected the soldiers and sailors. And around Invergordon, I'll remind you that all the pubs from 1914 were actually in the care of the state. They took them over. Such was the worry that alcohol would play imagine anyone drinking, surely that wouldn't happen, that there would be a problem. Anyway, there certainly was, and that was the government's answer. So we can get carried away with history, memories, archaeology, clash with a huge amount of data from everything. So we have to set a framework which is achievable. We have a number of themes which we can look at and can be divided we could divide these into regional groups, thematic or individual. The ways we can examine military remains in the social and political environment, archives and community leaves a huge number of possibilities to study. It may be best to consider these key themes in regional areas. Almost every military site has a camp. The trouble is, as archaeologists, as I've often found, is I've gone to what you could describe as the sexy bit. I've gone to the radar station, the coast battery, where the big guns were, where the airfield was, where the hangars were, and people tend to ignore the camp. They do so at their peril, because that's the important part of any site. That's the domestic site. These camps tell us and inform us actually what went on, and they leave a tangible archaeological trace, something to examine and record. These camps became social gathering places in certain instances, where locals could come and visit for events such as the cinema or dance or even sports facilities. These camps often introduced civilian populations to electricity for the first time, maybe even telephones. These are interesting places, often amazing histories, and tell us and tales of wrongdoings and rule breaking still abound within the Highlands when you go and speak to someone. Yet, there are other camps which are closed off, that was highly secret, that no public was welcome. We're blessed in the Highlands, we've got camps from the First and Second World War, but the First World War campsites are invariably very rare. And none actually have been studied archaeologically in Scotland, though hopefully that's going to be addressed by the work at Stobbs by Hoyk in the Borders. They come with extensive training facilities and systems. And some of these can survive, firing ranges, for example. But we're left in many cases with no idea of how the camp was laid out. What was the domestic? What was the if you like, the living part, whether it was a YMCA or a canteen. So we're lost lots of these campsites across the Highlands. There's 3 depot sites, as they were called, in the First World War, around the Cromarty Firth. One been built over and has lost, that was in Invergordon. But the other 2 at Nig and at Cromarty, I wonder if I've got a picture of the one at Cromarty. There we go. missed out all my stuff. So there we go. I now know where I am. So Nick and Cromarty camps. Archaeologically, there may well be some of that left. I did have a nice picture of Nig camp with an elephant in it, but sadly I couldn't find it again in my library of images. But there are other camps, US naval camps. It would be great to find the midden at the US Navy camp and compare that to a midden at a British camp. It could be very, very different. And the camps of foresters as well. I turfed up with Susan at a site, and they found the midden at that site. And what was coming out of that was quite incredible in the space of just an hour. Unbelievable. So all of them are worthy of study. And it can be quite exciting. Moving on to POW camps, the military camps. Training is obviously associated with that. The large-scale training at Achnacarry and around the Fort William area and Arisaig must leave the odd trace. A few explosions like the one we see in the water there will leave archaeological traces. We can trace that. Perhaps you might not want to dig too much the metal detecting finds up, however. Anyway, moving on, POW camps. They've never received the attention and interest that they deserve. And we've got a couple of real major ones. Kinlochleven, for example. Once again, here we go. Kinlochleven and another one by the shores of Loch Leven down for the aluminium smelter works. These are fairly substantial features. That entire camp for the British Aluminium Company can actually be traced on the ground. All the building platforms that you see of all the buildings in that site can be seen on the ground. And it was something we can look at. There are other prison of war camps. Bran up by back of Maryborough, Watton up in Caithness. They are there to be examined and looked at archaeologically because they hardly survive any standing buildings, only in one or two cases of prison of war camps in the Highlands. So they're there to be looked at. Fixed defences all around. The pillboxes is obviously something that everyone sort of looks at and gets very excited about, but actually they're only one part of a more larger system that you should actually look at. When looking at a pillbox, one should examine, are there trenches nearby? What's it overlooking? Is it overlooking that roadblock and rail block that exist? There's a reason for a pillbox being built. You have to understand why and think about, in the mind of a commander, why they would build it there. We then move into the realms of the Home Guard, who often constructed many of these things. Sometimes just to give the men something to do. So you end up with structures in strange places that make very, very little sense in a strategic role. Fixed defences can be found around lots of places within the Highlands. Wick, Invergordon, Bonner Bridge, Inverness. I had a picture earlier up there of one at Inverness. All around Inverness were a series of trenches, barbed wire enclosures, fixed defensive points. The rail block and road blocks on the A96, what is now the A96, and what was the old A9 at Clachnahary can still be seen. There's still tangible remains there. And when one looks at all the road blocks and rail blocks, there are some in bizarre places. In Middle Strathcarron, on the Achnasheen Road, there are road blocks. And the picture that was showed earlier on of, I'll just go back, yes, road blocks all round the place. And some of them just don't quite make sense. But they don't make sense to us as we look at them in isolation. What we're doing is missing the rest. Where are the rest? Can we find the rest? Because then that makes that picture of movement from east to west a bit more, put the flesh on the bones of that particular one. We could be looking for auxiliary bunkers which were built for a basic guerrilla force after the war. There are a number of them. Some of them have been noted on some of these interest sites, but there are a large number missing from the Highlands. We've got training establishments which run right through to the modern day, like the work The Royal Commission undertook work at Cape Wrath on the training area there. But we have training areas still extant at Fort George, RAF Tain. We've got the Torpedo Naval Training Area on the Sound of Raasay. There are military training areas everywhere. So, we also have naval training from the Second World War, where we have lochs on the west coast, which have evidence of boom defences, purely for training naval personnel on how to get through them. We also have the post-war, wartime and post-war Royal Observer Corps posts, and the Coast Watch posts. Right round the entire coast of Scotland, there were small structures built in which people would watch the seas for ship movements, for submarine movements, and these were manned 24 hours a day by members of the local community. In the First World War, by Boy Scouts, even. And so that we don't know where they are. We have references to 20, 30 in the Highlands, but no idea where some of these are. So we need to think about looking at these tiny little structures, often in very, very remote, isolated places. I have a couple of real big sites that I would love to see in the Highlands, a lot of work focused on. One of these is Loch Ewe. It is perhaps the largest military site in the Highlands, and it is certainly the poorest studied. It has massive AA defences, all aspects of naval activity, shore bases, oil stores, supplies, camps, booms, defences, coastal batteries. Some of these features short-lived, as always with some military stuff, but others lasted the entire war. Such was the importance, it was always normally only referred to by its code name, Port A, and is seldom mentioned in the records, so our search in the archives is a real problem. The site encompasses not only the loch, but around about, as far as Achnasheen, which was the main railhead for the site. There is a building in Achnasheen that has a military association. A full research programme there will be required to map the remains and understand it further. But it also has First World War activity, which no one has really looked at. So we need to understand that. And it also has Cold War remains as well. The new museum at Gairloch is taking over the former post-war 1950 built anti-aircraft operations room. And that was put in because Loch Ewe was deemed an important anchorage into the 1950s. And the Cold War sites are not uncommon. Listening stations, training again, radar stations, barracks, post-war AA positions at Loch Ewe are all important to piece together the archaeology of that period of history. While some of these buildings are still extant, their use has changed. However, many in the Cold War sites, which have long been abandoned, and we're looking at abandonment maybe 60 years. So we're losing that knowledge. During the Cold War, as it is in both all the wars, the north of Scotland played that key military role in accessing the Atlantic, as well as providing, as it does, training grounds and a key military bases. So, a proposed research framework should, in summary, take into account the discovery and recording of military sites, and to take targeted research at military and forestry camps, taking account of the social aspects, such as their involvement, effect, social and economically, on the local area. Discovery and the community involvement with coast watching posts and ROC posts, both First World War, both Second World War and Cold War. For example, this bunker up here at Achnasheen. You don't get much more remote. Detailed survey and research of individual sites, complexes, such as Loch Ewe, as I've already stated, and Cromarty Firth. Projects looking at the social and commercial interaction between the local communities and their new military neighbours. For example, the housing, the purpose-built housing for Invergordon. And detailed investigations of the First World War and their legacies, such as this trench system at the back of Invergordon. Looking to the future, we must address the knowledge, engage local communities where information exists, and look at the remains, not just locally, but regionally, nationally, and even internationally, to understand, document and record these remains before we lose them. It is a time which, together, across the wider archaeological community, we can focus on the understanding and appreciate the legacies of these well-preserved remains within the Highlands from both wars. The Highlands are, in fact, actually well placed to focus research on the British mill activity because of the quality and the amount of remains for British mill activity, not just of the 20th century, but for the last 300 years in all aspects of warfare. Thank you.